Good morning, St. Francis, and good morning, people of God. It is Thursday, the 21st day of the month of August, 2025. Thursday of the 20th week of the year, the 20th week in Ordinary Time, is also the day in which we honor the memory of Pope St. Pius X, who was only a saint, some will say to his friends. Anyway, he was the Pope who permitted a reduction to lower the age for reception of communion, which was really something that was done kind of in one's teenage years, if not later on. It was still considered something that only an adult could understand and only an adult could receive, which was odd because you baptized children left and right, but you left out the pinnacle of initiation, communion, First Eucharist, until some point later in their life. And so Pius X kind of recognized that. Again, Pope at the beginning of the 20th century, and through his encyclical, see if I can say this, Trale Sollicitudine, basically stated that Eucharist needs to be received as early as possible for its effectiveness, to become part of our lives. And again, and this is where receiving, that means eating and drinking the Lord, is what St. Pius X was trying to promote and trying to push. Not adoration, not monstrances, not Eucharist in that way. And in fact, that, again, how we understand Eucharistic adoration today did not exist really even in St. Pius X's time. And the reality is, too, that anytime you wanted to expose the Eucharist outside of the solemnity of the body and blood of Christ, Corpus Christi, you had to ask the bishop's permission. Now we do it all the time. And again, that kind of ruling has never changed, but we do it everywhere and everywhere. And again, gazing upon the Eucharist is one thing, but Jesus tells us to eat and drink him. And that is where the effectiveness of Eucharist comes into play. And so Pius X recognizes this, and he says that we cannot withhold this, especially from the youngest of the youngest, so long as they have some understanding of what it is that they are receiving. Again, you don't want anybody, receiving it properly. But again, in the Eastern Church, Eucharist is given at baptism as an infant, so it is what it is. The West was always more problematic when it comes to Eucharist. It continues to be a little bit problematic when it comes to Eucharist still. But Pius X tried to open this up. And now he was not good at many other things, unfortunately, but this was one of his good things. And so we remember him for this and celebrate his memory on this day. Our readings for today, again, the Book of Judges continues with the stupidity of a military officer named Jephthah, who basically is fighting against the Amorites, because again, the Book of Judges is all about fighting against all of these people who either live within the Holy Land because Israel had left it a long time ago, or who are trying to move into the Holy Land because it's a good place to live. And so he makes this vow to God, basically to say, if you give me victory over the Ammonites, then basically I will sacrifice to you the first person who walks through my door after I get the victory. And God permits this. But remember, God doesn't like human sacrifice. God doesn't want human sacrifice. And so this is not going to end up well for Jephthah. But Jephthah wins the battle against the Ammonites, and he is successful, and he goes back to his house, and the first person to walk through his door is his daughter. And he cannot break his vow. Why? Again, this is where the understanding of vows and keeping vows is ridiculous, and you wonder why God just wouldn't let it ride. But God has to teach Jephthah a lesson in some ways, and so he's going to have to sacrifice his daughter because of his arrogance, again, and his stupidity and things like that. And so, so she basically agrees to be sacrificed. I think that's the 7th grade or the 6th grade going to religion class. She agrees to be sacrificed, but she says, let me go mourn my virginity with my friends on a mountain. So she does it for 2 months and then comes back, and Jephthah kills her. Again, this is where the Book of Judges is fantastic. And the history of Israel, we want the kind of this pious, sanitized spirituality in Scripture, and it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There is a lot of wrongdoing and arrogance and pain and suffering and torment and things like that. And the question is always, what is God's plan in this? Where is God's presence in this? And it's a good question to ask. And this is where combing through the early books of Scripture, the Hebrew Scriptures, the First Testament, allows us to kind of reflect more and more upon just what kind of God calls us into relationship, and what is the meaning of this relationship between ourselves and God. In the Gospel today, again, the Pharisees, again, Matthew continues, the Pharisees and scribes still trying to fight with Jesus about the kingdom and who's invited and who's not. He gives the parable of this great banquet in which many people are invited, no one comes. And the person who's holding the banquet gets kind of angry, sends out more messengers, to come to the banquet, and they decide to kill the messengers and things like that. Again, it's the similarities to the prophets and to Israel disobeying and not listening to God, all kinds of things like that. And then the guy says, well, then curse all of those who wouldn't come to my party, and let's go out to the byroads and the highways and whatever it is. Just bring in anybody you can see to fill this banquet hall so that it looks like I'm successful in having a party. And the servants do, and the banquet hall is filled. And then there's this one guy who's not wearing the proper clothes and who has no explanation for why he's not wearing the proper clothes. And he is cast out into the darkness. Now, again, what's wrong with this guy? It's like, again, it's not really clear. The guy doesn't say anything. Is he just kind of muddling through? Is he just not aware of what the invitation is all about? Were any of these people who were at the highways and byways, in thieves and robbers or whatever they were, did they have any idea of what they were being invited to? But, the thing is, again, it's to understand the invitation, to understand the relationship with God, to understand what God is calling us to in relationship with this God who loves us, who wants us to experience the most wonderful things in life we can, is not something to be taken lightly. It's not something to be disregarded. It's not something, to be just a hobby or a pastime for us. It must be taken seriously, because in many ways, this banquet to which we are invited is the banquet that gives the most meaning to our lives than anything we could imagine. A blessed day, St. Francis and people of God. May the Lord give you his peace.